Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is the historian Peter Parker, who has put together an extraordinarily interesting series of books, 2 volumes, called Some Men in London. It's an anthology of contemporary sources about gay male life in London between 1945 and 1967, which was the year that homosexuality was partially decriminalised in Britain. So we're looking at contemporary attitudes in the years running up to decriminalisation. We spoke about why there was an idea that homosexuality was enormously increasing in the post-war period, the connection between the military and male prostitution, the role of blackmail in the debate on whether decriminalisation was necessary. And then in the extended part of the episode, we spoke about the medicalisation of homosexuality, the public attitudes towards lesbianism, which has never been criminalised in the UK, and also about Jeremy Thorpe and his rather incredible story and what his experiences reveal about attitudes towards gay men at the period. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where, as ever, you can find the back catalogue of extended episodes, the bonus episodes I do with my husband, and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we can't really understand ourselves or understand the world around us without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to put you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions, which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. Peter, should we start by talking about the historical context of these texts that you've compiled? Because not everyone will know the chronology exactly in terms of decriminalisation of homosexuality in Britain, and indeed what was the legal status quo at the time of writing of these various documents.
Yes, well, the book is arranged in 2 volumes, the first from 1945 to 1959, and the second from 1960 to 67. And so basically we start on VE Day or VE Night in 1945, and the trajectory of the book is towards the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, which happened with the Sexual Offences Act in 1967, in the summer of 1967. Before that, any homosexual act was illegal. There were all sorts of different categories of crime, as it were. So it was anything from importuning for an immoral purpose, in other words, soliciting, picking someone up either in a street or in a public lavatory or in a park or wherever you might be doing it. That was the sort of the minimal crime. Then there was gross indecency, which meant you had to be caught in the act rather than just procuring the act. And then there was buggery, which was actually, oddly enough, the legal term for sodomy. I mean, to us, sodomy sounds slightly more technical than buggery. And in the 1940s, if you were caught and taken to the magistrate's court, you might get a fine. And in the 1940s, the fine was between £5 and £15, which doesn't sound much, but in today's money, it's a sort of equivalent of about 170 to 510 pounds. So considerable. For a second offence, then in the 1950s, to keep up with the rate of inflation, the fines went up to £25, which is about 690. For a second offence, a magistrate could send you to prison, and the terms were between 6 weeks and 6 months. If you went to the Court of Sessions or the Assizes, so if you were a persistent offender or there was a particular circumstances that meant you couldn't be given a summary fine or a prison sentence, then you were tried by jury, and the penalties were 1 to 2 years in jail. For buggery, which was the highest, technically that was, you could be imprisoned for life. That was what was on the statute books, though in effect at this period you'd probably be facing anything between 1 to 5 years, occasionally a bit more, up to 7 years, but mostly that. So that's the sort of legal framework that we are working within throughout this book until 1967.
Am I remembering correctly that you quote some numbers at some point in terms of how many cases the courts were dealing with per year, and it's in the hundreds, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, in the country, it was even more than that. But yes, and I mean, I quote somewhere in the book that in a single month in September, I think 1948, I think 47 people came up before a single court. It was the Lambeth Magistrates Court, because there were several magistrates courts in London. So it was a lot, and part of the reason for this was that it was felt I mean, one of the reasons I start in 1945 is that it was felt that after the war, England had gone into a terrible moral decline. This was partly, it was thought, because men were away at war. So a generation of people were being brought up without the domineering father figure who would keep them in control. So there was a great deal of concern about youthful hooliganism, teen crime, and homosexuality, and the rise of prostitution. So this is why it became such an issue from the sort of 1940s onwards, particularly in the 1950s and the 1960s, but also in the 1940s. There was an idea that homosexuality was vastly increasing. In fact, what was probably happening is that prosecutions were increasing due to police vigilance. It's very difficult to tell, how many gay men there were around, because obviously they weren't doing surveys, and a lot of people wouldn't admit to it even if they were asked. So the trouble is that you're always relying on what are basically crime statistics, which of course can skew the picture of what life was like.
Yes, and also there's this apparently prevalent idea at the time that homosexuality was an upper class thing.
Yes, this is one of the things that I particularly wanted to explode. Or, I mean, it's not, other people have done it before me, but there was this idea that somehow working class men wouldn't dream of indulging in homosexuality unless they were corrupted by their social superiors. And this was something that was said in newspapers. It was said by politicians, increasingly, I mean, rather disgracefully, by a lot of Labour politicians. You'd think that the Labour Party might be more liberal in its attitudes. But in fact, there was quite a lot of that. We're the working classes and we're decent, upright folk. It's these upper class decadents. But in fact, if you look into court reports, it's quite clear that although the usual suspects, schoolmasters, clergymen, etc., were arrested, they were vastly outnumbered by people who were just manual workers. The blue collar homosexual was very, very real, and particularly in working class districts, in the courts of working class districts. So, yeah, I produce a list from the that period I mentioned in 1947 of people who were up before the courts, those 47 men. And really, they were all things like unemployed labourers, waiters, domestic staff. So this idea that homosexuality was just a sort of upper class affectation is entirely untrue. I also, of course, writing a book like this, I wanted to give as wider a sort of spectrum of views and lives as possible. So I very much wanted to get in some of the experiences of working class people as well as upper class people.
So there are diary entries, lots of news clippings.
Yes,
Yes, a whole,
letters,
yeah.
parliamentary reports, police reports, and sort of things to do with the cinema and the theatre, fiction, a couple of poems I managed to get in. So yes, I wanted to, really, it's because what I wanted to do was create a mosaic of what life was really like for gay men during this period. And I wanted as many voices as possible, not only the hostile voices, of which there were many, but also the voices of the gay men themselves, telling us what it was like for them. And there were a couple of sociological studies which are particularly interesting. Carried out. There was a man called Michael Schofield, a sociologist who also wrote under the pseudonym of Gordon Westwood, and he did a couple of books. And then there was another man called Richard Hauser. That's a bit later in the 1960s, and they went round and actually interviewed gay men, and then published, verbatim what they said. So you actually hear their voices, which is quite rare, to actually get these voices sort of unmediated.
You mentioned this concern about rise in homosexuality after the war. One of the things that comes out a lot in the sources, which I wasn't aware of, was the both real and perceived relationship between gay casual sex and the military.
Yes.
So that you had a lot of, you described these amazing scenes. Well, not you, but your sources describe
Yes.
these amazing scenes in, say, Hyde Park of guardsmen
Yes.
out on a Friday night, sort of soliciting. And often men, I think, who are not necessarily, you know, on the Kinsey scale, strictly gay.
Yes.
They're also
Yes.
having relationships with women. But anyway, tell me about that relationship with the military, because it's quite distinctive to the period.
Yes, well, there has been a very, very long history of gay men being attracted to men in uniform. And of course, most of those men in
And indeed,
uniform,
straight women.
and indeed straight women, yes.
Yeah.
And those men in uniform tended to be of the working class rather than the middle class. So there were certain pubs where sailors on leave and soldiers and even airmen could be found. But the for some reason, the Brigade of Guards have always, I mean, I say have always, perhaps not now, but in the past have always combined their ceremonial duties, escorting members of the royal family in public parades and so on, with casual prostitution. And this goes way, way back. I think there was an Irish bishop who was had up in 1822. He was visiting London and was found with his trousers down with a guardsman in a pub, and it became a huge, huge scandal. But even in the later Victorian period, in the 1850s, you find writers like John Addington Symonds picking up guardsmen. And it was, although the military authorities always tried to deny it, it was just a well-known thing. And in fact, people would be, if you were a new recruit, older soldiers would say, if you want to earn a bit more, your pay isn't very much, and you're at a loose end on a Friday night, these are the places to go. Give an old chap a nice time, and you'll get paid, and then you can go off and pay, use the money on your girlfriend or whatever. So this happened a lot, and the military authorities. There was a court case in the 1930s where someone who had actually a guardsman who tried to blackmail one of his former lovers was had up in court. And he said, well, we all do it. We're all, we're told by the older guys where to go. And the military authorities were horrified. But they always sort of tried to pretend this wasn't happening. But it really was. And so in this book, you get various things like the diaries of people like George Lucas, who was a civil servant who spent a great deal of the 1940s and 50s and indeed beyond at Marble Arch, which was a particular place where guardsmen could be found. In fact, guardsmen, most of the sort of popular places to pick up men in the London parks, they were always the parks with the barracks nearby, because that's where they were. And there was a magistrate who was interviewed by the Wolfenden committee and said if he had his way, Hyde Park would be floodlit at night to prevent all this vice being carried on. So there was this, and you get it from the top right down to the bottom that it was anybody who wanted a bit of scarlet. It was, as it was known, after the guardsman's uniform. They knew where to go.
And I think one of your sources describes that the day after payday, well, they paid once a week, I suppose. So the day after payday, you'll see guardsmen out with girls because
Yes,
they've got the money to spend on
that's
drinks
right.
for women,
Yes.
and then the day before payday, you'll see them out with men, or clearly soliciting in places like Hyde Park.
I mean,
Yeah,
very, very flexible, the guards.
I asked a friend who used to be in the army whether the guards still have this reputation. He said no. So either he's oblivious to it, or there's been some change since the
Well, I
mid 20th
imagine
century.
life, yes, I imagine life in the army is rather different, and people are they're better paid, and I think that they probably get more leave to go and spend time with their wives and girlfriends. But I couldn't possibly comment.
Presumably, it is the pay. Presumably, they were underpaid. This was the big driver. I mean,
Yes, they were under, I think they were short of ready money, but it's always said, oh, these guardsmen have been corrupted by the civilians, they take advantage of them because they've got no money. I mean, the pay wasn't very great, but on the other hand, if you were a soldier, your accommodation was paid for, your uniform was paid for, your food was paid for, it was all in barracks. So basically, what you earned was more or less spending money. Um, so I'm sure that there was money was a motivation, but there were people, who actually had long-term relationships with guardsmen. That people, the Chips Channon, the Conservative MP, he had what he called a favourite guardsman who would see on duty and when he wasn't sort of coming round for drinks. And people like the literary editor John Layman, the writer J.R. Ackley, um, James Pope Hennessy, the historian, all of them had sort of relationships with guardsmen that were more than just one night stands, though they did usually involve you having to pay in one way or the other, treating them to a drink or a meal or something like that.
yeah. So that's one of the things that really stands out to me when reading this is the slippage in terms of prostitution and other kinds of cruising, cottaging, etc. Like that, for instance, this thing of like I think one of the first diary entries you have is from it describes VE Day, and describes a man who basically has a marvelous time on VE Day,
Yes.
which
John
includes
Barrington, the
right,
photographer. Yes.
which includes getting drunk, partying in the street, and also picking up at least one man for sex. And he doesn't pay him, but he does give him a bottle of whiskey or something like that. There's an expectation of some degree of goods changing hands.
Yes, I think I think again that's the thing of a disparity between uh, incomes of the soldier and his client. But that of course I wrote a biography of Christopher Isherwood, and there was a lot in Berlin of people like him and Stephen Spender and W.H. Auden, these middle class men going and picking up boys. And paying in one way or the other, buying them a shirt or something. But it's quite clear that the moralists who said, oh, they're exploiting these people. I mean, the boys often had the upper hand, and they could just say, oh, right, I'm not coming round then unless you give me another shirt. And so the idea that it was some form of exploitation. I mean, no guardsman was forced to do it. It was a tradition, but no, if you really didn't fancy it, no one was actually going to make you do it.
So it seems to be a difference in conventions in terms of this underground world.
Well, I think it's interesting you said that slippage between prostitution and sort of just casual sex, because I make the point, I found out somewhere in some document that the police's attitude towards male soliciting, they really didn't treat them any different from women who were professional prostitutes and were there simply to make money. In fact, they treated the prostitutes better, because if you were a woman prostitute, you could often get off just with a caution. But the percentage of men who were given a caution, I think this was in the 50s, was just 1% of those picked up. Whereas for the women, it was something like 60% were given a caution. But there was an attitude that if you were out there trying to pick up a man, you were as a man, you were as good as a prostitute. And of course, a lot of people were hanging around public lavatories. Of course, they wanted sex, but they were also looking for companionship. And there weren't that many places. I mean, if you weren't in a park or a lavatory or a public baths or the Biograph Cinema in Victoria, and various other places, there were pubs and there were clubs, but it wasn't as easy as it would be, to just meet people socially if you were heterosexual.
Mm. And this is, of course, a long time before Grindr and dating apps and so on.
Yes, I mean a very very different. No smartphones, no grinder, no mobile phones to take round with you wherever you were. Yes, it's a very very different world.
One of the things that becomes clear when reading some of the hostile commentary that you include in the book, so particularly in the media, there's some very particularly, is it the Express? I think it's the tabloid that has a particularly sort of vehement tone in some of this reporting.
Well, I think most of them do. I mean, I think it's hard to discriminate, but I mean the Daily Mirror, the Sunday Pictorial that then became the Sunday Mirror, the Express, I mean all the tabloids, as we would now call them, were on the whole hostile. I think it was the Express. Well, the Sunday Express had a columnist called John Gordon, who was a ferocious Scots moralist, and he was always, as he put it, slapping down the pansies. And the News of the World famously always liked reporting any sort of sex scandal. I mean, heterosexual or homosexual. But it's when you get to the editorials and these things like these filthy people. One article was headed, or how to spot a possible homo. The war on vice. I mean, the attitudes were hostile, but the attitudes of readers might not have been quite as hostile as those of the journalists. I think the journalists thought that they were pandering to public opinion. But of course, public opinion is often quoted, but very, very difficult actually to quantify. I mean, it really is. And I give the example of John Gielgud, the famous actor who'd just been knighted and then was found cottaging in Chelsea and was arrested. And although he gave his profession, I think he gave his name as Arthur Gielgud and his profession as a clerk. Obviously, he was rumbled fairly quickly.
Yeah, Gielgud is a bit of a
And
giveaway, isn't it? It's not that
yeah, it
common a
is a bit of
name.
a giveaway, yes.
Yeah.
And the trouble is that he like a lot of people who were not open. I mean, not that many people were openly homosexual. They might have been among their friends, but if you were an actor or a performer or in public life in any way, there was this genuinely held belief that if you were exposed as homosexual, that would be it, curtains for your career. But in fact, I tell the story that John Gielgud was, when he was arrested, he was rehearsing a play and they decided to go on with the play. And he was standing in the wings, very anxious about going on for the first night. And Sybil Thorndike, who was also in the cast, sort of propelled him on stage, said, "Go on, John, take a deep breath, just go on stage." And Gielgud stepped on stage and there was a standing ovation. So it just shows that a lot of public attitudes, you might say, particularly amongst people who went to the theatre, who might be more liberally inclined than anyone else. But it was more complicated. And when the Wolfenden report was commissioned and recommended that homosexuality should be decriminalised, several newspapers carried out polls amongst their readers about whether they thought the law should be changed or not. And it's interesting that although the majority thought the law should stay as it is, it was only a very small margin. It was sort of 50-something% versus 60-something, 50% saying it should be changed, 60% against, which if you read the papers, you would have thought it would be something like 90% saying the law should stay and 10%. So, and of course, politicians hid behind public opinion when the Wolfenden report, which recommended that homosexuality with certain provisos should be legalised. It took a year for the Parliament even to debate it, or the House of Lords debated it fairly soon, but the Commons didn't do it for a year. and they just said, oh, public opinion won't stand for any change in the law. And it took a lot of campaigning to persuade politicians that actually this wasn't the case, that actually public attitudes were not nearly as severe. Of course, there were a lot of people who absolutely loathed everything about homosexuality, and one MP said he'd had a letter from a constituent who said he thought all homosexuals should be castrated, and he would volunteer for the job. So you did have some extremists.
Yes, I mean it's interesting. There are a lot of actors, right, crop up in these
Yes.
sources, lots of diaries from actors and so on. And there were a lot of actors at this period who were, of course, closeted, but there was sort of a recognition from audiences. And if anything, there'd sometimes be little sort of nod, wink, wink jokes almost that everyone sort of knew. So presumably the public were, they knew about this. They weren't oblivious to the fact that there were some of their most beloved actors were privately gay.
Yes. Well, one of my favorite pieces in the book is, I think, a rather charming newspaper article, which a young woman reporter goes to interview three eligible bachelors to ask why they haven't yet found the right girl. And they are the playwright Terence Rattigan, the royal couturier Norman Hartnell, and Ivor Novello. And I think most of the readers would have known precisely why these men had not found the right girl. And
Yes.
it's not clear whether this is a genuinely naive article or whether it is it's an in-joke. It's done with immense charm. I don't know anything about the woman journalist, but I think she did it with. I mean, it's just a very nice piece, but it does tell you a lot about how these supposed secret lives were not that secret at all, and not everybody cared one way or the other.
A source that I found particularly interesting, partly because I used to be a columnist at the New Statesman, is the collection of letters from New Statesman readers talking about in response to
Yes.
some article about homosexuality, and they reveal a very quite measured opinions among members of the public. And the one thing that really stood out to me is that more reasonable people tended to view sort of steady relationships, let's say, what's sometimes quite charmingly referred to as living as married kind of relationships, as sort of fine, people keep themselves to themselves. But there was a degree to which people saw prostitution, sex in public places, and the legal status of homosexuality as kind of the same issue, and also very young men, even adolescents, selling sex to older men. That was a kind of a bundle of issues, and to some extent, what gay campaigners managed to do successfully was to disentangle that bundle and to say, no, actually, people having same-sex relationships is not necessarily the same thing as these other concerns that people have. Do you think is that an accurate representation of how the debate went?
I think that's very accurate. Yes, and I think it has to be said that the New Statesman and the Spectator generally, editorially, took a very liberal view and both thought that the law should be changed. And not all their readers agreed. So you do get these debates within the letters columns. The campaigners, modern gay historians have been, I think, they're a bit hard on people like Peter Wildeblood, who was involved in the Lord Montague of Bewley case and went to jail. And then he wrote a book called Against the Law about his experiences, in which he said, I am homosexual, this is what it's like, and this stuff. And he sort of says, we want proper respect, not for the sort of the mincing, painted boys who wander up and down the streets. And some contemporary historians say, oh, stuffy old Queen. What about the outrageous people like Quentin Crisp? Well, they have a point, but of course, they were merely being pragmatic. I think that one way to persuade politicians and the public at large that homosexuality there was nothing the matter with it, was to say that actually a lot of homosexuals you meet in the streets, you wouldn't know they were homosexual. They live quiet lives with another man at home. They act exactly the same as heterosexuals. And of course, that was a lot easier to present as as it were, the acceptable face of homosexuality. But I think, that was a very sensible tactic, because in the press, in the tabloid press, every time homosexuality was mentioned, you'd always get painted faces, picking up boys, prostitution, as you say, those sort of things, and obviously that didn't give a very good, you know, promiscuity. A lot of people didn't like it anyway, regardless of whether it was heterosexual and homosexual. And there's someone, I think a parliamentarian, I can't remember now who it was, who said, well, look, actually looked upon objectively, the sexual act is not terribly pretty, whether it involves men and women or two men. And, we need to get away from that and to think more about the actual, as it were, love between people. But of course, sensationalist press wanted to talk about, the less publicly acceptable attitudes, examples of homosexuality. But of course, it could equally be argued that the reason men were having sex in the park was that there was nowhere else for them to go. They couldn't necessarily put someone back. They might be living with a landlady or in digs or something, and so it wasn't easy. And I think that most people who had sex in parks, were pretty discreet, found the thickest bushes they could. Though, of course, some of them did get caught, including Ian Harvey, the Conservative MP, caught with a guardsman in St James's Park. But I think I think there was, again, in the New Statesman, I think one of the correspondents replying to a man who said, I think it's very distasteful. I want to have fun with my girlfriend. I don't want all these men having fun with each other. And the woman correspondent replies, well, you may want to have your fun, but it's easy for you. You can have fun and nobody's going to jet. But actually, watching people have sex in a park, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual, isn't something everybody wants.
There's this film, I've forgotten the title for a second, I'm sure you'll remind me, with Dirk Bogarde. And is it from this period where he plays the lawyer who's being
Yes,
blackmailed?
that's
What's it
Victim.
called?
Victim.
Victim.
Yes, it's
Really, really
1961, so it's in volume
right.
two.
Oh,
There's a
great.
lot
Okay.
about it,
Okay,
but I'm
okay.
happy to talk about it. It's
Yeah, please. I saw it maybe last year, and it's really fascinating. I think it's on YouTube. I mean, easily accessible, and it's such an interesting historical artifact because the Bogard was gay, right, and was again one of these actors where people sort of knew, but it wasn't public.
Yes, well, it's hard to tell with Bogarde because he denied it so vehemently for so many years, and in fact never really acknowledged it. I mean, the thing was that he was a great matinee idol with many, many female fans. Young women adored him in things like The Doctor in the House and various romantic dramas. And in fact, it was very brave of him to take on this role as a married but basically gay barrister. Um, and the other, I mean, there are so many interesting things about that film because it was an example of how the British Board of Film Censors worked with filmmakers. The Lord Chamberlain's office that licensed plays for production, so every play that was put on in a public theatre had to have a license from the Lord Chamberlain's office. And they would basically say, send us the script. And then they would say, this is acceptable, or this is not acceptable, or this will be acceptable if you cut this, that, and the other. And they wouldn't really until late 1950s accept even a mention of homosexuality or anything. That was absolutely taboo. The British Board of Film Censors worked entirely differently. They worked with filmmakers. And so they said, well, send us a synopsis and we'll say what we think, and then send us a draft. And Victim was written by a husband and wife team. Janet Green was the principal writer, but her husband, John McCormick, also worked on the script with her. So it's interesting, it was written by a heterosexual couple. And they sent back and forth and had great arguments with the British Board of Film Censors about what they could include. The British Board of Film Censors at one point said there are rather too many homosexuals in this film, which, given it was a film about homosexuality and blackmail, seemed rather odd. But in fact, they did a lot of the points they did eventually win, and so the film is sort of very, very frank. The other thing about the film that is important, I think, is that it was filmed in London in very recognizable locations, and the gay men in it seemed in most ways sort of perfectly ordinary, like anybody else. And prior to that, gay people were in films as sort of screaming, hysterical theatricals, or sinister murderers or murder victims. So it was interesting that part of the film, although it was a thriller, it was clearly a work of proselytism intended to contribute to the debate. And in fact, when the bill was finally passed, partially decriminalising homosexuality, Lord Arran, who had piloted the bill through the House of Lords, wrote to Dirk Bogarde. This would have been 6 years later, after the film was released, and said, I think this film swung public opinion towards decriminalising homosexuality, and you should be proud that you've made this film, and that now, we hope, people won't live in fear of blackmail as they had before, as they had in the period of the film. And blackmail, the possibilities of blackmail for gay men who, either a blackmailer would say, right, we'll tell your employer unless you pay us, we'll tell your family unless you pay us. And also, if we'll report you to the police and you'll go to jail. So by decriminalising homosexuality, you did remove much of the threat of blackmail. Obviously, people didn't want their families to know necessarily, but the sort of the blackmail that did lead people to commit suicide and go into despair, and a lot of the law change was to do with trying to eliminate blackmail. It was the great argument that one of the reasons homosexuality should be decriminalised was to put an end to blackmail, which was a worse crime. And of course, gay men who were blackmailed, people would say, well, why didn't they go to the police? But if they went to the police, they might incriminate themselves as homosexual and therefore be liable to prosecution. So it put them in a difficult position. But certainly there's quite a lot, this film is all about blackmail and why, and there's quite a lot of speeches in it where people are saying, did you know that all this blackmailing went on, and this is disgraceful. But I think it stands up remarkably well. I've seen it many times, and I think it's a very good film.
Oh, it's a great film, and Dirk Bogarde's protagonist is very sympathetic. So I can see why that would have swung public opinion on the blackmail question, because this is of course also the period when gay men are discriminated against in, say, MI5 and MI6 because of this blackmail risk and because it's considered to be compromising. Except there did seem to still be quite a lot of gay men in MI5 and MI6 at the period.
I mean, there was this idea that yes, if you were gay, you were open to blackmail, and therefore you shouldn't be in the Foreign Office because you might get a blackmail for being a spy. And there were cases like the Vassal case in the 1960s, where John Vassal, was convicted of spying for the Russians and had been photographed in flagrante while in Moscow, and was indeed blackmail. But it does seem quite extraordinary that someone like Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, the two missing diplomats, these people who worked for the Foreign Office and suddenly disappeared, and they'd fled to the Soviet Union, for whom they were both spying. But the idea that nobody could possibly have known Guy Burgess was homosexual seems to be absolutely inconceivable, because he was always drunk, spoke openly of picking up boys and men, and was just wildly indiscreet. And you'd have thought, why on earth was he being employed in the Foreign Office at all? And then, of course, when they were exposed, there were newspaper articles by huffing and puffing MPs who said, oh, well, they're obviously sort of sinister men who knew all about it in high places but protected these men. And I'm not sure they did protect. I think it was that sort of gung-ho attitude of MI5 and the Foreign Office, because there were lots of other gay men in the Foreign Office who were much more discreet, or someone like Harold Nicholson, who'd been a diplomat, who was in fact married, though he was married to a lesbian and was basically gay.
Is it Jeremy Wolfenden as well, who was the son of the
Yes,
author of the Wolfenden Report, and he was a spy?
well, it's very unclear. He had a very mysterious life and died in mysterious circumstances, but he certainly was being blackmailed. And he went, I think it was the Telegraph, to as a foreign correspondent to Russia. And there was clearly things going on, but I think he was being worked by both sides, by MI5 and by the Soviets. But it is a sort of one of those bizarre things that happened, that this very distinguished educationist, Sir John Wolfenden, who was appointed by the government to head up this committee investigating actually both prostitution and homosexuality, though it's the homosexuality people remember, did have a son who was gay. And Jeremy Wolfenden said, though he wasn't entirely reliable, that when his father said, "Now I'm doing this," and he said, "Oh dear, what shall I do?" And he said, "Wear less makeup." Uh, whether John Wolfenden, who I wouldn't have thought would have that sort of sense of humour, judging by many of his remarks in the Wolfenden report itself, but it is one of those sort of odd ironies that there he was working towards recommending the decriminalisation of homosexuality with a homosexual son.
There was that fun TV drama made about this a little while ago. I'm sure you've seen. Yeah. Going back to Victim, the film, there's the scene that I found most interesting is when the protagonist, the Dirk Bogarde character, is talking to some of his gay friends privately about and it's one of those scenes that makes it clear that this is sort of a political film, because it's
Yes,
it's clearly sort of has a educational purpose, right? And they're talking about this question changing the law and debating it, and the thing that is really emphasized by all of them is, we're not saying that, of course the age of consent should be much higher for gay men than for straight people, because that was true for quite a long time, wasn't it?
yes, yes,
Of course, we're not saying that children should be sort of, encouraged to be gay, any
yes,
of this. We're just saying we want to, it's really the blackmail, as you say, it's really the blackmail
yes,
risk, which is the key source of injustice.
yes,
And that is one of the scenes that makes the film feel archaic, because
yes.
you wouldn't have, you would definitely not expect to see such a
No,
conversation had in a contemporary film.
no. I mean, it's very much a film of its period, and as you say, it was a work of proselytism. Um, uh, but I think it still works even today. I mean, there was a great deal of debate about the age of consent, and when the Wolfenden recommendation was that homosexuality should be legal for consenting adults over the age of 21 in private, which did not include hotel bedrooms, apparently. And it did not, it only applied in England and Wales. It didn't apply in Scotland or Northern Ireland. And it didn't apply to members of the armed forces or the merchant navy. So there were a great many. This is why we always say, or was trying to remember, say, partially decriminalized, which is true. But there was a lot of debate about the age of consent, and there was a rather sinister, I find, psychiatrist who was the sort of go-to psychiatrist. He was called Clifford Allen, and he had a practice in Harley Street and had what I think was a very unhelpful specialization in homosexual activities and homosexuality. And he, for the Wolfenden recommendation, said that he thought the age of consent should be 30. Um, so, I mean, there was much more debate about whether it should be 18 or 21, but there were people who thought, well, it might be decriminalized. 30 seems an extraordinary, rather arbitrary age to have chosen. Um, what were these poor people supposed to do in their lovely 20s? They had to wait till 30. But fortunately, Dr. Allen's recommendation didn't go through.
This is, of course, Oh, sorry, just about the military question before I ask about medicalisation. So just to be clear, Wolfenden report recommendation was that members of the armed forces should not be allowed to have gay sex ever, not even
Yeah,
just like while on
no,
duty.
no, not at
Right,
all, not
because
at
of
all.
this
So if you remember,
association with male prostitution.
well, I don't think it was so much that. I think it was thought that the military authorities thought, well, what happens if, say, a private starts having an affair with an officer? It would be terrible for discipline. And I think there was a slight feeling of, one bad apple, the whole British Army would suddenly turn gay. But the armed forces, I mean, it took another how many years, several decades before that was finally the homosexual acts. They did change the law so that you could be homosexual and serve in the armed forces, but you still couldn't actually have sex. And then that was finally, but I mean that was in I think it certainly wasn't until this century, I think fairly well into this century, that they finally changed that law.
Yeah, yes, and of course, don't ask, don't tell persisted in America for a long time.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yes, this seems to be the last sort of holdout of legal restrictions. And I wonder about this. Okay, so my personal theory as to why the destigmatization of homosexuality has happened so quickly, and when it did, second half of the 20th century onwards. My theory about this is that women tend to be less homophobic than men, and there's quite a lot of data supporting this idea. There are, of course, some women who are deeply
Yeah.
homophobic, but
Yes.
yeah, but it does tend to be less common in women. My theory is that the influx of women into journalism, politics, the sexual revolution has affected women's working lives, led to a change in elite attitudes towards. That's my theory. What do you think? The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.